everybody, and welcome to the October wrap-up, which should be coming to you more or less middle of the month, and I am filming it on the 1st of November, so early for my doing, but yes, I am finally caught up again to all these wrap-ups, and let's hope that I stay caught up to them, rather than what has been happening in recent months again. The month of October has been a month in which, book-wise, there hasn't been a ton of progress, as in I don't have a big pile to show you. I think the first book that I finished this month, I also finished like on like day 21 or something like that, you know, like super far into the month. I have not had much progress in Becca's Bookoplathon or Spookoplathon as I would have liked to. I was just too shattered in my reading throughout this month to have much to show for it. I've basically, most of my goals throughout the month have made me spread out what I was reading, so making progress in everything that I was reading, and not really allowing me much time to focus specifically on like one or two books, getting them finished. So yeah, I don't have much in terms of the actual count of books that I finished, but I will say like I did still read like 3,000 pages, which I kind of always consider that I read around 2,500, 3,000 pages, so this is definitely just like an on average month for me in that regards. It's not a month in which I did barely any reading, it's a month in which I did just a normal amount of reading that I tend to do, and so it is just that, you know, some of that progress went into books that I'll only finish in November, maybe even December. But yeah, I have had a pretty decent month, all things considered. And let's just talk about the books that I did manage to finish throughout this month. The first one that I finished, where did we start the month? I filmed my September wrap-up so recently. Like, I edited my September wrap-up so recently, but somehow this has once again escaped me. I kind of want to say 17, but the screen will tell you the real number. But so in any case, the first thing that I finished this month is The Untold Lives of the Women Killed by Jack the Ripper by Hallie Rubenhold. So this is a non-fiction book. It is about the 5 women who were killed by Jack the Ripper. And as a consequence, this book places almost no attention to the character of Jack the Ripper himself. I think the introduction is the most that you will ever hear of Jack the Ripper throughout this book. Even in the separate sections of the book, his name isn't really mentioned all that much. So the book is divided into mainly 5 sections and then an introduction and a conclusion. And the 5 sections deal with each one of these 5 women and talks about the information we have about their life, kind of narrating, chronicling their life as we know it. And it's interesting to see how much we actually know about these women, considering how long ago they died. Of course, because of the sort of like press attention that went to the case of Jack the Ripper, I'm assuming that that means that around the time that these women were killed, that they were able to more easily retrace some of the information about these women than we would be able to do, and that as a result of that we have more information about them than we maybe have about any sort of like random other lower class woman in that time period. But we do have a ton of information here, which I just really enjoyed. It was just really interesting to see these lives of these 5 women and thus get an insight as well into what's life for women in lower class society was like at that time, or like different life paths that were possible. So through their life you find out a lot about, for example, workhouses, or you know, the relationship between lower class women and marriage, and kind of the dynamics between women who weren't part of marriage anymore, like if they'd left their husbands, for example, how they were still kind of reliant on entering in some sort of a relationship with men, often, most of the time, because you know that's just the way that they needed to go about things at that point in time, but how that was viewed and how that would work and things like that. So And one thing that I especially enjoy about this book as well is that it gives us an insight in how the legacy of these women kind of twisted their lives and the perception that people have of who they were, and how careful consideration of the facts that we know about these women actually make us go, there is no real proof that these women were prostitutes. It was just a convenient narrative for them and a convenient MO to give to this killer. But actually only the last woman is somebody who identified, or like self-identified as a prostitute at some point in time. She's the only one of which we know that at least at some point within her life she agreed that yes, she was a prostitute. For all of the others, we don't have any proof of the fact that they were ever prostitutes, and so it is only conjecture that would make us go, okay, these women were living a life in a poor district in London. They didn't have anybody to take care of them, so how were they making their money? Oh, they must have been a prostitute. Or this woman was married but she was having relationships with a guy outside of her marital bed, so she must have been a prostitute, even though she was just sharing her life with somebody else, but that one person was always the same person, and it wasn't in exchange for money or anything like that. It was just a new relationship, and because at that point in time you couldn't just and because of the taboos within society, you couldn't just remarry because they had never actually officially divorced neither, for example. So I thought it was a really interesting book to listen to. Unfortunately, this is the type of thing that goes in one ear out the other, so I only have sort of like the general conclusions that will stick with me, hopefully for a very long time, but unfortunately the real specifics of these life stories just tend to disappear almost immediately again. So yeah, I'm hoping that maybe one day I'll reread it, or maybe one day they'll make a documentary series out of this, because when I visually see something, when I visually consume, then that tends to stick into my memory much better than it does while reading. And because I'm somebody who does not make images in their brain when she's reading, then that reading doesn't stay in my memory the same way that movies would do, for example. So yeah, that's the only unfortunate thing about it, is that I really enjoyed it a whole ton, but right after I was already a little bit hazy about oh yeah, which woman was the one who had this or that, or what was the life story of the first one again. So yeah, the fallacy of my brain is the one downside to this reading experience. And so the next book that I then finished, I think in the order, is Your Blood, My Bones by Kelly Andrew. I finished this one during Camp Halloween, because this one, basically this book had a ton of possible prompts in it, but I used it for a witchy read because our protagonist is basically a witch. But let's not consider it in those traditional lines. She's only really referred to as a witch by another character in the beginning of this book, and she herself doesn't identify it as that, or doesn't give any sort of indication of knowing how to do witchcraft, or knowing this about herself, for example. So basically we have these three friends who as kids were hanging around the house of the girl's father, and there seemed to be some sort of cultish behavior going around in this house. At one point in time the girl was kind of taken away by her mother, and now decades later her father has passed away, and she returned, and now decades later her father has passed away, and she returns to this house to kind of basically set it on fire, I think was her intention. But when she arrives in the house, in the basement, she finds one of her childhood friends strapped to a tree, and finds out that he's basically an immortal, who they were doing cult-like experiments on, kind of sacrificing him to appease the monster in the woods. So this one is a dark book, featuring creepy creatures, cannot speak anymore, featuring creepy creatures. There's some creature that can mimic people in the woods, then there's this weird creature in the woods that, you know, don't really know much about where it's from, what it actually is. There are people from the cult who are also interested in her returning to the house. And then their other childhood friend also returns to the house, but it's a little bit unclear whether we should be trusting him or not, because in any case, the boy in the basement definitely doesn't trust him. I initially enjoyed this one. I was initially intrigued and interested in this one, but I definitely kind of lost my interest the further along we got, because I just feel like it is so drawn out. Ultimately, I like the book, or like the dynamics between all three of these, and I like some of the later book revelations, but I just feel like we spent so much time in that middle section, like dragging out the will they won't they between the boy in the basement and this girl, where, you know, like both of them have a lot of resentment for one another and are like, he's like threatening to kill her and all those types of things, whereas, you know, as a reader you can see like these, they clearly just still love one another, like just get over it. And that was just dragged out too long, to the extent that I kind of lost interest with it by the end, because I was just like waiting for it to be over by that point. This author has also written The Whispering Dark, and characters from The Whispering Dark do make an appearance within this book, in case you enjoy that type of like intersection between different books by the same author. So this is the same world that they are inhabiting. But so yeah, ultimately this one didn't work all that well for me, and kind of makes me wonder whether my enjoyment of The Whispering Dark was mainly due to the fact that I had like no expectations for it, and so it exceeded my expectations, whereas this one, then I went into expecting to enjoy it the way I had The Whispering Dark, and then just fell like a little bit annoyed with by the end. Next up, I finished a ebook. So I finished Kushiel's Mercy by Jacqueline Carey. This is the third book in the second trilogy in the Kushiel universe. In the Kushiel universe, we are looking at what is basically a sort of medieval type version of our world. All the nations are named differently, but you can kind of see the link to our real world nations. And we are set in the kingdom of Terdange, which has a sort of like reverence for the idea of love. Love is sort of like the guiding principle. It's the god that they worship the most, and so acts in the name of love, you know, like as long as, you know, there's no taboo when it comes to love, for example. So, you know, like kinky sex and all those things is fine. Same-sex relationships are fine. You know, so it's more sexually developed than our present day is, for example. And in that setting, we are following a young girl called Fedra, who grows up in a pleasure house and who is recruited by a guy who's basically hosting a spy network, and who trains her in the art of, you know, figuring out schemes, observing people around her, gathering secrets, and, you know, like plotting as a consequence of that. But a third of the way in, something happens that sets the plot in motion. With all of these books, I've always felt like there is that moment, a third of the way in typically, that kind of ricochets the plot, and from that moment you're kind of like sucked in and you need to get going. With the first two books in the second trilogy, I've not had that same sort of sucking in moment. I've not been as invested, and so as a consequence it's always been more slow going for me than it was in the first trilogy. But with this third book in the second trilogy, I definitely had that, and I had that like hard. The moment, like this one has a sort of like plot in which the enemy basically succeeds at one of their own schemes, and the protagonist kind of has to find a way to reverse it, or find a way to break whatever the opposition has done, to undo it and to reclaim victory, let's say it like that, to be like as spoiler free as it can be about all of that. And so that really got like that got me rushing, that got me going like, oh yeah, I want to see where us doing this, I want to see us achieve this. It had a lot of action and plot was really moving forward, which I really enjoyed about these, because I do feel like they can take quite a long time because they are really huge. They definitely take a lot of time to get through. They really develop and establish relationships and all of those things, but sometimes it can be just a little bit too slow for my liking, and so this being a lot more of an action-packed book really worked for me in that regard. So yeah, I'm really eager I'm really happy to have finished this book. I'm really happy to have finished this trilogy, and I'm happy that it ended on a high note for me personally. There is a third trilogy within the series as well, which I will then be tackling within 2025. Next up, yesterday evening, I finished The Principle of Moments by Esme Jakiwi Pearson. This is a book for Magical Readathon. I use a scroll of extension to be able to count this for my Magical Readathon calling, and so for that I had to finish it within October. So yesterday evening I had to be like, let's get cracking because I need to finish this one. And yeah, that probably tells you enough about this book because I have not really been enjoying it. So this is too action-based, I can guess, to some extent. And it's not necessarily the fact that it's too action-based. I guess it's just not character-focused enough for my liking. Characters are always sort of like my must-have. It must have good character work. I must care about the characters, and unfortunately that didn't really happen in this book. I think the only character or the only dynamic I grew to care about is the dynamic between George and Orby, and that is a dynamic that I feel we kind of abandoned for a lot of the book. So in this one we're looking at two stories mainly that kind of meshed together at one point in time. So we have Asha, who is a girl living on a planet ruled by aliens. She's basically doing like factory work for them, very much suppressed, barely getting by. And one day she stumbles upon this guy who was visiting her mother, who shows her a vision of a girl imprisoned who turns out to be her sister, and so her goal becomes figuring out how to save her sister. And then our other character, Obi, is a time traveler who has lost his father. His father at one point in time stepped in time and abandoned him, and he has been time traveling to try and locate his father. However, he suffers from an illness that basically means that like a body part splits off whenever he travels through time, so now he has to kind of stop time traveling because he fears that like if he were to try again, then you know, like he won't make it back anymore. And so he has made it back to a 19th century London, where he has basically abandoned the crown prince of the United Kingdom, who he was having a romantic relationship with. And so it's this relationship that I care about, but pretty early on there's a development that sees Obi meet up with Asha's storyline, but that sees him kind of abandoning George's timeline and George's story. And we don't fully abandon George, because George basically is actually visited by Obi's father from that point onwards, but I feel like we get very little of the George storyline from that point onwards. And even though we still have some of George's storyline, without Obi there I also was not as interested, because what I was mainly interested was this dynamic between these two characters, and so for a lot of it that was missing. And this book has a lot of errors in it, a lot of like sentences that kind of change structure halfway through, repetitions of words in it, like right after one another, or omissions of words here or there, misspellings, grammar errors. So yeah, this definitely needed a better editor. I feel like the editor did a really rushed job on this, I think, because you know, like just reading it through it on a first go, there are so many instances in which you're like, huh, what? And I have to reread the sentence like 5 times to figure out like why the sentence looks so weird, and then seeing like, oh, okay, like yeah, this word is missing or whatever. So like if an editor was just like reading through it, they should have already spotted like half of these problems. So I feel like that definitely wasn't like definitely wasn't a great job that was done on this book by the editor in that sense. And I also feel like an editor should have really pointed out that there's just, I don't know, there's something wrong with it. It's like there's so much in there that it just becomes confusing. Like by midway through I was confused about a lot of things, and these didn't really clarify themselves anymore, and I also just really lost my interest in it at that point in time. I was not invested enough to care about like, wait, so are we like, to try and clarify the confusion or try to go back and figure out like what I was missing here. And so by the very end, first of all, like the further I got into this, the more difficult it was to pick it back up. And so by the very end of it, I was no longer really comprehending what I was reading, just reading it for the sake of finishing that magical readathon TBR. And yeah, I was just like crawling my way through it, you know. The last evening I had to read 27 pages, and that was like torture, you know. Like, it's just 27 pages, why was it so difficult? But I was really just like reading for the sake of reading, just to finish it, and I was getting like 0 out of it at that point in time. So unfortunately this wasn't for me at all, and I'm gonna say unfortunately it's also a series, so it has a continuation. It doesn't end on a way that resolves the situation. And so like, why did I struck with it? Like, really just because of magical readathon. That's the real answer. But so yeah, unfortunately a miss for me. And then the final thing that I finished is Bloodguard by C.C. Robson. This is a gladiator inspired fantasy romance. So we have this girl who's basically the heir to the throne. Her grandmother was the previous queen. She was killed and her father was basically blamed for it. So her father is now put to prison, and her goal is kind of to become queen so that she can release her father, because she does not believe that her father was actually responsible for the death of her grandmother. Her uncle is kind of the regent at this point in time, and his son is interested in becoming her husband, because that would mean that he would become king, but she doesn't want that. She is looking for somebody else to marry, and so she decides that because nobody else is really interested in becoming her husband, most likely because they don't want to oppose this guy who is like the son of the regent, she decides that her only chance is this gladiator who is fighting in the arena, and he just has 3 more matches that he needs to win before he will become a bloodguard, which would basically make him royalty, which would mean that he would be eligible as a future husband. And so she recruits him in exchange for help in the arena, help with inside information or like getting weapons into the arena ahead of time so that he can survive these games. This is a fantasy romance with quite a lot of plots behind it, or quite a lot of world building is more what I wanted to say. It is a deep world, it isn't just a superficial world that we are inhabiting just to have a romance take place within it. And I would definitely say that even though the romance is definitely a big part of it, it is also not like the point of the book, you know. I think there's a lot of focus put on the relationship, especially in the first half of the book, but then the plots and the scheming and strategy and like backstabbing and whatever, all those things really come into play a lot in the second half, and the second half is very much about the world against them. The first half is kind of about them growing closer to one another. They are pretty attached to one another early on already. There's like this initial tension between the two of them, initial dislike and stuff like that, but quite early on this grows into attachment and sort of like willing to do anything for the other type of attachment, like a really deep attachment. And so the first half kind of focuses on establishing this and kind of, you know, like them admitting it to one another and all of those types of things. And then the second half is really about like surviving against the world who's trying to break them apart. And so yeah, I did really enjoy this. Like in the end, this is like a 3.5 stars because, you know, like it isn't exceptional or anything like that. It isn't my new favorite thing in the world. I enjoyed it, yes, but it is not super deep neither. It doesn't necessarily have thematics that really speak to me neither. It just like was a real fun palette cleanser between some of the like, it was just a really nice, you know, like palette cleanser between some of the, you know, like harder, deeper, denser stuff that I've been reading. But that is definitely much more preferable to something like A Principle of Moments, where I'm just struggling to it by the end because I'm not invested. I was definitely invested in this. It's just that I don't necessarily think that it stands out amongst the things that I've been reading, for example. But so yeah, that's the final thing that I read throughout this month. You will have seen the number go down, the numbers will go up one again, because this one is a book that I also got in October, so it was added and removed again in the same month. So that meant that we are starting November with 13, I think, right? On the TBR, 13 books. For those of you who are regulars on this channel, you know that I'm reading all of my books at the same time, and that the goal is, like the deadline is the 1st of January. I want to finish all of these books by the end of the year. So 13 books in 2 months' time, in which I will be away for 2.5 weeks, in which those 2 weeks I might not have much reading time. I won't have much reading time. I will have some reading time though, so some reading will happen, but I cannot predict how much reading will happen. So yeah, it is exciting, I guess, but yeah, we'll see how I do. So far I think, you know, like definitely in the final 2 weeks of the month, I've done what needed to be done to get to a healthier point at the beginning of November. But also in terms of what I have already read, I have definitely quite a way into most of those books. Third of the way in almost all of them except for 2. So yeah, that is also a nice starting point. It isn't like I need to read 13 books start to finish still within those 2 months. I am a third of the way into most of them, or even further. So that's also something to keep in mind, I guess. But so yeah, that's going to be it for my October wrap up. The biggest success for this month was Kushiel's Mercy. Mainly because of the fact that I've struggled, saying much, but mainly because of the fact that, you know, the second trilogy hadn't really been up to par with the first one for me personally thus far, and so this book really like redeemed the series for me. So like I think the 5 is also a really good read this month as well, you know, but that was one that I went into knowing how much everybody loved it, and I just like loved it the way that other people love it. So it was just kind of expected, whereas with Kushiel's Mercy I was hoping, of course, to have the same experience as I'd had with the first trilogy with this book, but I was kind of prepared for the fact that that might not be the case. But so yeah, that was my biggest success for this month. Definitely let me know about your reading month, if there any standout or not in your reading month, and if you've read any of these books and want to share your thoughts on them, definitely feel free to do so as well. But so yeah, with that I'm gonna leave you guys here now. See you guys for the next video. Bye!